This is called Naked Man Hides. Everybody knows this. Sometimes you lose everything, including your clothes. I must have taken them off at some point after the crash. I can't remember. I must have felt hot. How else to explain why I took off all my clothes? Helene came to the jail the next morning and showed me the paper, and we even laughed about it at first. Above the fold, Naked Man Hides After Crash. They'd never given anybody much of a reason to buy the independent journal before. I should get a cut of the sales. Helene said she hadn't come to bail me out this time. I said, "When have you ever?" That's when she started to cry. She wanted me to understand what I'd become, as if I didn't know it. She thought shoving a headline in my face would help me see in black and white what everybody else saw, not just our kids, my parents, her parents, my sister, but everyone in San Rafael. You went to college to end up here? I told her if I had any shame left, I'd yank it out of my throat and stuff it down again. Helene threw the paper on the floor and stood up and knocked on the little window to let the guard know she wanted out. They brought me back to the cell, and I sat there and trembled for hours. It was hell, of course, but it's also a little like having the chills when you've got the flu. You're grateful because that seizing your body's doing helps keep you warm. I'd gone from so hot to so cold. Must have been sitting there for hours. I remember, though, at some point they tried to give me lunch. I couldn't look at the food. Same later on with the dinner tray. Before lights out, they brought in 2 new guys. Because I'd been in there alone, I'd taken the single. These 2 got the bunk. They each took a long piss and went to bed. At 11, they turned the lights out, not off completely. And I sat there in what passed for darkness. You know how your eyes adjust to what little light there is. I looked across the cell, which was maybe 7 by 9, and I saw the 2 sleepers, both of them wrapped in white sheets up to their necks. The fat one was on the bottom. He was a stranger to me. I'd seen the skinny one around town. He was still shaking. I was still shaking. But like I say, some part of me almost half enjoyed it. There was a blanket I could have pulled around my shoulders, but I didn't. Amazing what our bodies are designed to take. Helene says, I'm looking at 5 to 6 on a good day if the judge got laid the night before and had some waffles for breakfast. 8 to 10 at least if he didn't get much sleep and was suffering from an upset stomach. Possession of a controlled substance, driving under the influence of said controlled substance, driving under the influence of another controlled substance, unlawful taking of a vehicle, reckless driving, fleeing the scene of an accident, failure to follow a lawful order, resisting. It was your car, Helene, I said. How was I supposed to get to work? Who was going to pick up the kids? In what? But what I'm trying to say is that while I was watching those guys sleep, just 2 guys snoring, coughing, gurgling, moving around, changing positions, trying to get comfortable on those slack mattresses, I felt something, let's say, beyond my immediate predicament. My mother once took me and my sister Frances to a museum. We were in Chicago visiting cousins. It was an Egyptian museum. What it was doing in Chicago, I don't know, but there were these mummies in glass cases, and I remember how I pressed my nose against the glass and stared at a wrapped-up body of a woman and wondered what she'd make of me, some 10-year-old kid, almost 2,000 years later, snooping on her infinite sleep. My nostrils up against the glass, you know how it makes you look like a pig? I was doing that. I wanted to get as close as I possibly could. I whispered hello to her head, to her old head wrapped in that yellow burlap. Was it burlap they used? Hello, I said, hello. Frances asked, who are you talking to? And I said, who do you think I'm talking to? I'm talking to her. It was like that with those 2 guys. I was only trying to get close, to establish a little camaraderie across the chasm. Do I make any sense? Except with these 2, I didn't need to move towards them at all. My 2 fellow fuck-ups asleep in white sheets. I didn't need to move an inch. I swear, from my bunk, I stroked their faces without needing my hands. The skinny one had stubble. I felt it grow beneath my fingers. The fat one was clean-shaven, his face slicked with sweat. I could have licked his sweat off my finger. And I thought, holy fuck, we're not dead. Together, we're not dead. As in, not dead yet. Think of all the years we will be. Our bodies turn to caramel. I read that. You with the tiny sprouting tendrils of facial hair, you with the sweat-wet cheeks. Together at this moment I thought, don't laugh at me, Helene, we aren't dead. You think this isn't a net positive? So, that's the dude in jail story. I like to go to. I used to hang out a lot at the trial court, the criminal court in Center Fell, and I'm also I'm just interested in what goes on in people's heads when they're put away like that. I'm going to read a couple more pieces, and this one's also from California. Let's see. Sorry. Oh. It's called. Where'd it go? Disappeared. Sorry. It's so short, I can't find it. This is called Tamales Bay, Emily. From the kitchen window, this is also California. From the kitchen window, she watches the fog lift. She often wakes early and waits for it, this moment when the vague curtain rises and there it is, the bay and the mountains beyond. She always feels, as she does now, exalted, but at the same time unworthy. She grew up in the Midwest, where beauty is filched in glimpses. As a kid in winter, she'd walk down the street to the edge of the bluff and look out at the Lake Michigan, through the leafless trees. She'd watch how the waves would push the shards of ice forward as if trying to unload the burden of them onto the beach. A kind of grace. Still nothing like this. The bay, the mountains, this fog thick and smoky. All hers now, this view from the ridge. But that didn't make it any less anybody else's dream. This house, this kitchen, this big window. She'd always considered it a kind of arrogance of the rich to imagine that there was one place on earth destined to be yours and only yours. Neil says they can move any time. Say the word and we'll go, he says. And she knows that if she were to call his bluff, he'd do it. He'd sell the place. For her, he'd sell anything. But then he dragged this house around in his head. So what would be the point? Why not stay? Still, there was no getting around the fact that the Polaroids of his dead wife on the wall in the kitchen unsettled people. When her sister visited from Madison, she took Emily aside and asked, "Why don't you make him take those down?" She told her sister that she did it for his children. You know, so they can still come home to home. You know what I mean? This explanation was only half true. And she knew, of course, that the 4 grown-up kids in their 20s and 30s would certainly have understood if the pictures came down and were shoved in a drawer. And it wasn't as if Neil hadn't offered. No, she'd actually demanded that the pictures of his dead wife stay up. She didn't expect her sister or anybody else to understand. She'd never spelled it out to anybody, including Neil, but there was something about being a permanent guest in her own house that felt right. Last Thanksgiving, when the children had all come home, one girlfriend, one husband, a couple of grandkids, she and Neil had made an enormous spread, homemade cranberry sauce, a small mountain of mashed potatoes, a turkey they'd slow cooked for 11 hours, and everybody had such a good time, and she'd felt not only tolerated, but welcomed, even loved. The following morning, she'd slept late, not slept, stayed in bed with a magazine, because again, this was their house, the house they'd grown up in, and she did want them to feel like they could come home to home. But when she had at last come down to the kitchen in her robe, the chattering, the jokes, the laughing stopped immediately, only for a moment, but enough to horrify them with embarrassment and remorse. They all spent the next hour or so trying to make up for it, forcing her into every reference. She'd searched in vain for a silent way to say, "Please, please, I get it. There's no need. All your years here." She stood in the kitchen gripping her coffee, pleading with them, with her eyes, but they were too busy frantically including her to even notice her anymore. And yet there must have been something inside each of them, even if they didn't admit it to themselves. After all, didn't they want their father to be happy after so much heartache? Didn't he deserve to be happy? Still, it must have been galling. She wasn't a whole lot older than Neil's oldest daughter, which didn't scandalize anybody. This was California, but there was no getting around the cold math. The house would be hers. Not soon, but soon enough. Their dead mother smiling on the wall. The photographs have faded over the years in the sunlight so that they've begun to look like x-rays. Didn't that ghost on the wall demand loyalty? An ex-boyfriend once told her that she had a way of using magnanimity as a weapon. This wasn't exactly a fair assessment at the time, though she dumped kindly the boyfriend soon after. Still, she'd been intrigued by the possibility and hadn't ever since put it past herself that kindness itself can be wielded. She drinks her coffee and watches the light above the bay, now green, now pink. Neil will be up soon, and they'll both sit here and look out the window together. No, she doesn't belong here. No, if she has a place at all, it's back in Illinois. But this doesn't mean it isn't hers. Isn't that the way of it? Neil's retired. Now his job, with a saggy tool belt, is fixing things around this ramble of a house. She works from home, writes marketing copy. But she told the old busybody up here on the ridge, his beloved neighbor for decades, the one who told her how pleased she was to see such joy and light back in Neil's life, that she was working on a memoir in the shed. You know, Catherine lingered for years. It was beyond dreadful. Yes, Neil, she died in the house, you know. Yes, Neil, what's your book about, if you don't mind my asking? I'd rather not say. I absolutely respect that. Thank you. Certain things one has to keep to oneself. Yes. Neil certainly found himself a young one. Says she's writing a book. Says she can't talk about it. Some unspeakable trauma. Who's not writing a book is what I'd like to know. Who's not writing a book in this entire county? What makes her think we all want to read about it? Out back, there's an orchard that predates the house. It's August, and huge yellow apple trees, an ancient variety one you could never hope to find in stores, have begun to drop off the gnarled trees. So we're going to leave California now. So long, California. We hope you're still there tomorrow. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to read from a longer story. I tend to write pretty brief stories. I don't know why. I just like to kind of have a story that I can almost grip in my hand. But sometimes I got to let it go a little longer. So I can't read the whole thing here. I'm just going to read a few pages of it, and then I'll end by reading a tiny piece of a novella that happens at the end of the book. Sound okay? All right. So we're going to go to the Midwest, where I feel most comfortable. Although I should say there is a section of this book that takes place right here in this very area. Those stories are too sad to read. So I leave you with that. This is called Ineffectual Tribute to Len. After graduate school, I hung around another year and drove a cab for Iowa City Yellow Cab. The cab was a boat, a Chevrolet Capri wagon. I could have put a mattress in the back and lived in it. I didn't hate the job. I'd sit in the Kroger parking lot and read. If the dispatcher radioed and I liked the sound of the call, I took it. If I didn't, I went on reading. My indifference did not make me popular with Ovid de Menares. I once asked him over the radio if he'd ever read Ovid, and he said he didn't answer personal questions. He's got some real smutty stuff, I said. Dead air. I didn't have to drive a cab. I was broke, and the only money I had was the play money left over from my student loans. Now I can't pay them off with real money. Even so, I was not a cab driver. I was a grad student, an ex-grad student pretending, and I'd sit in the parking lot and read and occasionally drive somewhere and pick somebody up and drive them somewhere else. At Deadwood, 2:30 a.m., I earned some chops picking up blitzed undergrads. When one of them puked in the back of the cab, I stopped in the middle of the street and ordered them the fuck out. But it's fucking freezing, man. It's fucking Iowa. Out. That made me feel like a cabbie. And I used to take calls out at an encampment along the river west of town. Out there, people didn't live in tents or boxes, but in full-on shacks constructed of scrap wood and sometimes even a few bricks. Nearly impossible to find. It wasn't on any map. You had to bumble along a series of rutty dirt roads, south, then head north again before you could go west that close to the river. It may have been a derelict property, or maybe it was some kind of no man's land in a flood zone. Ovid would put out a general call to anyone on duty. Who wants to pick up some ancient freak by the river? If nobody took it, he'd re-cue his mic and say, "Ornery, you want to get off your pampered ass and put the book down and work?" The freaks weren't that ancient. Maybe they were in their mid-50s, but most of them had lived so many years outdoors in Iowa. Their faces were perpetually red from frostbite. In winter, the tall trees hid nothing and blocked no wind. I'd trek out there and stop in the center of that scattering of hunkered makeshift houses and wait and see who jumped in the cab. More often than not, it was a grocery run. A woman who called herself Bertie once squeezed my forearm. Bertie always sat in the front seat alongside me and invited me to shop with her at the Kroger. Nobody had requested my presence in a long time. We were both in need of some company. I remember she bought a single loaf of bread, cottage cheese, and some chocolate. The fare itself was double the cost of the food. Another night, a guy having a bad trip started bouncing on his seat so hard his head bashed the top of the cab. His girlfriend was passed out next to him, but every time he bounced, she'd wake up and shout, "What, what, what?" She had a pretty snub nose and was wearing sweatpants. Neither of them could tell me where they wanted to go, so I drove in circles. Mostly, though, I sat in the Kroger parking lot and watched the shoppers push their carts out of the swinging doors and listened to the sound of those wobbly wheels struggling across the potholes in the pavement and went back to reading. In February, it was always February that year, just as I was about to leave for my shift, Len called from Chicago. He'd been calling a lot that winter. He liked hearing stories about the cab. He thought now that I was becoming hard-boiled, I'd have something to write about aside from being a lonely horn dog. "How many horn dog stories can one person write?" he said. "Lots," I said. But that night, Len said he wanted to talk in person. "When?" "Now. You're 4 hours away. It's snowing. I don't have a car, and I have to work." "You got a cab," Len said. He'd been my boss at a summer camp. He was one of those people who pop up randomly and change everything, and you can't imagine any story of your life, lame as it might be, told without them. Len was one of the first people to notice something, anything in me. It was only a summer camp in Wisconsin. How to express the significance of the place and of Len without sounding completely ridiculous. My job was to entertain rich kids from the suburbs while their parents went on vacation. But for Len, after so many years working in psychiatric wards, good training for any administrator, he'd say, camp had become a kind of gracious calling. Part hippie, part drill sergeant, his mission was to instill in us that rich kids are not these noxious little fuckers. We're at their core human. If by the end of the summer we could make them a little more so, we'd have accomplished something. Because don't forget, these world inheritors will go forth into the universe and become CEOs and heart surgeons and white-collar criminals. Imagine if they were a tad more decent, a smidgen more compassionate, my kittens. Imagine. Len would stand before us during staff meetings in the push shack and exhort, his protruding stomach lording atop his skinny legs, his wild shoulder-length hair, his chaotic beard, and big white teeth. All camps have their characters, and our leading man was Len. There was something of the werewolf about him. And even when he said something completely banal, like, "We work hard so we can play hard," I'd think, yes, that's it, that's the key. Why hadn't I thought of that? "Seize the day," Len would say. "Set yourself up for success, gentlemen." He'd raise his monstrously thick eyebrows and dare us to challenge such time-tested wisdom. He was both profane and cheesy. And the whole time he'd be sucking on one of those cigars he kept in a constantly replenished stash along with bourbon in the bottom drawer of a desk so strewn with the junk of summer, flippers, softballs, frisbees, confiscated candy, confiscated porn, spent cans of off, bags of charcoal, we never saw the top of it. Smoking was forbidden, except behind the camp kitchen, behind the rec hall, but Len's loyalty to camp was so strong that even when he broke the rules, and Len spent his days breaking camp's rules, it was his way of respecting, loving the institution for instituting the rules in the first place. And on days off, Len would take me and a few other carless counselors to gamble at the casino in Bad River. It was from Len that I learned how losing all the money I had could not only be a full day's entertainment, but was also honorable in itself. The least you could do for the Chippewa Nation, Len would say, is hand over your lousy $25. No? What'd they give us? Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, Illinois, Canada? I stole my own cab and drove across I-80 through the snow. one more scene. Len may have been HIV positive for years before he finally became so frail he had to be hospitalized. He never told me any of this. I put it all together later. When he called, Len always made a point to say he had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was probably technically true, because camp was always on his mind. It would not have done to employ a man with AIDS. No distinction would have been made at that time between HIV positive and the disease itself, not at a boys' camp in Wisconsin in the mid-90s, no matter how much of a beloved character he was. For years, he'd hid it from us all. If I only had Hodgkin's, he'd call me and say, whoever this asshole is, it's not having Hodgkin's that's really fucking things up for me. Now it no longer mattered, at least as far as camp was concerned. He was finished. He'd never get back up north. The summer before the winter I drove the cab to Chicago was the first one Len had missed in 18 years on staff. He called me to relive past summers. Not the specifics, because all summers were the same. That was the point of camp. You didn't go up to camp because anything new ever happened. You went to camp because history repeated itself. The lake will always be too frigid in June to put the docks in the water, but how are you going to put the docks in the lake if you don't get in the water? And the camp dog, not the dead one, the new one, will always bite a nurse from Scandinavia. And a stoned junior counselor from Kansas City will always hit a tree in front of Saul Q's, and Saul Q will always run out of his cabin in his underwear and squeal about how the drug culture is ruining camp, totally ruining camp, the drugs. And years ago, before anybody's time, there will always be a kid whose name nobody remembers who drowned off the point. By the time I pulled up to Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital at 3:30 in the morning, I found Len drinking coffee and shooting the shit with the security guard in the lobby. Gone the pot belly, gone the crazy hair. The man was gone. What, you drive here from Tashkent, he said. He introduced me to the guard, a buck-toothed old man with a large head of curly hair. The man reminded me of Henry Kissinger. Ted, Len said, this is a grad student. Grad student, this is Ted. You ever met a grad student before, Ted? Never so up close, Ted said. Aside from the fact that he was wearing slippers, Len had decked himself out in his old, now baggy camp clothes, a fleece jacket, and slung across his now skinny shoulders his red Duluth pack. A couple of years ago, cleaning out the basement, I found that red DTA pack in a puddle of water. It had been lying there so long that when I knelt to pick it up, the thing came apart in my hands. I thought I was supposed to break you out of here, I said. Ted guffawed. He tried to give $100 to every nurse on the floor. He tried to give me $100. I told Daddy Warbucks here he's free to come and go. He wants to be locked up. Call the precinct captain. Besides, I told him, the hospital only steals direct from insurance. Or is it the insurance that... Anyway, Len slugged the dregs of his coffee and shouted at me, lead the way. And then he bolted out the door ahead of me into the night. I shrugged at Ted and followed. Fat chunks of puffy snow were thumping down from the sky. Gingerly, Len moved towards the cab, watching his step. But even in his new slowness, there was his old sense of half-baked purpose. Where are your boots, I asked. Camp, Len said. My boots are at camp. I wish you could hear the sound of Len's voice, which in its heyday was a combination of chuckle and growl. And he always spoke under his voice, as if to pull you into a common conspiracy. That night, as we crept through the thumping snow, now Len drove like he walked, with timidity laced with determination, up and down the unplowed streets. His voice was so hoarse there were times I couldn't hear what he was saying. We drove through the dawn before ending up at the White Castle on West Madison, where we must have had at least 30 of those square little burgers between us for breakfast. And then Len drove himself back to Rush Presbyterian. He died a month later. I took the bus back to Chicago for the funeral. I'd been fired from Iowa City Yellow Cab. When I brought the cab back to the garage the day after that last night with Len, Ovid de Maneras said I was lucky he wasn't pressing my balls in charges. He wanted cash. He wanted me to cover wear and tear on the car because he said based on the mileage, I'd driven to hell and gone. I gave him $2 of the $300 Len had stuffed in my shirt pocket. Len would have thought the funeral a complete hoot. It was a full-on camp reunion. He was 51. And I'll leave it there. Goes on for a while. Len tells him a story that he seems to want to get off his chest throughout the night. So that's what happens. How's everybody doing? Okay. I'm just going to read a tiny little 2.5-page thing to end. Does that sound okay? And I'm happy to take any questions if y'all have any. All right. So this is, we're in 1977, not too far away from here in Fall River, Massachusetts. The two characters are Walt and Sarah Kaplan, and they're married. They have been for many, many years. And I wanted to write a happy marriage story. I hadn't had any of those. All my relationships went south in my work. So this is this is my idea of a happy marriage. You might, who knows? Anyway, it's 1977. Walt has had a heart attack before this. Right. But this is chapter 2. Chapter 1 is the heart attack. I'm sparing you the heart attack, and we're just going right into the bedroom in chapter 2. So 2 months later, it's called August bedroom. He sells furniture. She works in the gift shop at the hospital. Walt and Sarah, the heat, the swelter. It's August, Fall River. I don't know if you've ever been driven, or if anybody's been in Fall River in the heat of August. It's pretty intense. All right, start over. Walt and Sarah, the heat, the swelter, they lie, panting, separate beds. The air conditioning's been out since Tuesday. You want to push the beds together, Sarah says. Snowy thighs in the dark. And Walt thinks, what an offer. What did I do to deserve anybody's thighs, much less thighs like these thighs, when two beds merge? And yet later, glorious after, he knows that he'll wake up in the darkest hour with the heartburn he's always convinced is another heart attack. Now that he's at a real one, you'd think he'd be able to tell the difference, but the heart is a fraudster, a greedy muscle. Walt, Sarah says. Yeah? I said, do you want to push the beds? God, yes, Walt says. But you're just laying there, Sarah says. I'm indulging in anticipation, Walt says. One of the most unsung of life's great pleasures. Actually, studies have shown that anticipation is chemically more potent than, Walt. Their little bedroom in the dark. It's nice how the two words cling together so natural, bedroom. Rolls off the tongue, bedroom. Miriam used to pit her in here more than half asleep from her little room across the hall and climb into bed with her mother and immediately conk out completely. And he thinks of those nights, how he'd bridge his arm across the beds and nudge her, and Sarah would murmur, Walt, the kid. And he'd say into the darkness, this kid wouldn't even be here in the first place without a little wada wada. They'd leave the kid sleeping in their room and creep across the hall to the kids. First time Sarah worried they'd break the bed. What will we tell her in the morning? We'll tell her it was Mama Bear, Walt said. Wouldn't it be Goldilocks, Sarah said. Isn't she the one? Slow down, partner, slow down. Walt tore at her nightdress like a hero. Let's see you, Goldilocks. It's funny, all those nights, and they only had the one. He'd always thought they'd end up with a house full of squealers, run a little piggery. Marriage is nightly romp. Who'd believe it? Who the hell'd want to know about it? And now, deep into their 50s, you want to push the beds? It's so hot, Sarah says, I feel like a baked Alaska. Baked Alaska's cold on the inside, Walt says. Did you talk to Angelo about fixing the window unit, Sarah says? He said he'd be here tomorrow. Didn't he say that yesterday? He says his wife's been sick again. He says this time the doc... Oh, Carmela, Sarah says, she can't catch a break. I'll go see her. Walt, uh-huh. What are you doing? What am I doing? I'm asking. Ruminating, Walt says, taking stock, mulling. Listen, Sarah says, I got Renda Grabois coming to pick me up at 7:30 for Frida's luncheon, and you know she'll be in the driveway at 10 after, so if you... Who eats lunch at 7 o'clock in the morning? We got to lay the table, put out the flowers, count the chairs, do the seating, the place cards, make sure the soup... Walt, Gittleman says you can use all the exercise you can get, including... You talk to Gittleman about carnal relations? You haven't got a bimbo somewhere, Sarah says. I can't take myself to lunch, Walt says. Al's been picking up the tab at Gus's. I mentioned it to him, and he says if I don't like it, he'll go to He'll go eat alone at Wong's. Bimbo, listen, Sarah. Don't start confessing, Walt. You got a confessing voice. Pringle, Walt says. Tonight, Sarah says, yes, give me a Pringle. Walt reaches for the can he keeps under the bed, takes out 2 perfect potato chips, how do they do it, and hands one across the space between the beds. And together, they crunch in the dark. All right, Sarah says, you want to get this show on the road or not? The dip in the ceiling where the dormer cuts into the roof, where he always knocks his head whether he remembers to duck or not. History of a room, this room. The single window where the 3 of them watched the hurricane of '53 lift the roof off the Cynthia Alves' house next door. The basement, Walt, we got to get to the basement. And Walt said, you think I didn't build you a sturdy house? And Miriam begging to go out into the yard because she wanted to fly just like the cars. The chest of blankets at the foot of the bed. How some nights in the 50s, before Angelo installed the central heating, they'd pile the beds high with blankets, and he thinks of the time before the cold went away. That was the best. When you were still so young, still so cold, but you knew that soon the warmth being birthed in the blankets would engulf you. The gap between the beds, that alley, that trench, that abyss made for breaching, because you always got to have a border to smuggle across. Why else maintain the fiction of the sovereignty of the flesh? But people do. Alf Dolinsky says he hasn't been laid since last Thanksgiving. Who'd want to hear that Walt and Sarah had found a way to still believe they were inventing it, even if they did it pretty much the same way every time? Sarah on top until she got tired, and she'd go on her back and say, Walt, finish the job. I got Renda Grabois coming, but even amid the sameness, there was always the hint of something novel because of some shift in position or thrust at a slightly different angle, or yes, a finger exploring again heretofore regions said to be unexplored. That they could still think they were forbidden territories was itself our exotic smells, our coughings, our strained muscles, and now, again, Sarah's snowy thighs, my God, who'd believe it. And after, still, even these days, we pant like a couple of sweat-greasy horses, slowed down, of course, who wouldn't? Oh, but in our day, Sarah used to fret, you think Mary heard? What if she did? Hurt the kid to hear us happy? Think of the 60s, when the whole country got a little wilder and we joined in and did it twice a night. You remember, Sarah? Now twice a night would be like rising from the dead, but history is history, and if not set down on paper, it should at least be ruminated upon. Sarah and Walt Kaplan, one night more than once, 2 entirely separate fornications. You got to acknowledge it all, otherwise, asking himself, otherwise what, Walt, what? To ensure we don't merely exist in the dead present, is that it? That the oblivion of the now as opposed to the ecstasy of looking back. But wait, if the present is the past, you fool, dissolving this very moment into pastness, then it is incumbent upon us now to create the past, because this is so obvious, it's so rudimentary. It's the uncreated past that is dead, not, yes, push the beds, I want to push the... Sarah? No answer. Sarah. And Sarah's puttering snores in the dark, and Walt lying spent in that same dark, and Renda Grabois, is Renda short for Brenda? Must be. We'll be here at 7:30, no 10 after, and why not just call it lunch? Why the extra eon? That's the end of that chapter.